All right. Well, good morning. My name is Liz Baxter. I use she, her pronouns. I am the CEO for North Sound Accountable Community of Health, or North Sound ACH, and really appreciate you all joining us for this continuing series that today's session is going to be focused on stigma and reducing stigma. And it is part of a monthly series that we do around advancing a just and inclusive culture. So thank you all so much for kind of being in space with us where we all get to learn together, identify some areas where we all might want to do either individually or collectively some deeper dives on some of these topics. As you saw, there was a note for you to introduce yourself in the chat. And so hoping that you can do that. We are going to be using the chat throughout the session. If you can keep your camera on, that's really great. I know bandwidth issues sometimes get in the way or just kind of not a good morning for you to do that. But if you can, especially while you're speaking, we'd really appreciate it. Just a reminder that the meeting is being recorded. And we do that just so that if there are some folks who would really like to listen to this again after the session, or anyone who just had something come up and wasn't able to make it today, that they've got the ability to do that. If we could go to the next slide with our land acknowledgement, thank you. So we start all of our external and internal meetings with this land acknowledgement, and it's usually followed by, what have we heard kind of currently around things in our region, in our state, around the tribes. But we begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. And there's a link here on the slide if you want to, look up where you are right now, where your office is, where you were when you were in sixth grade. It's a really great website that allows you to actually see the tribal land where you've experienced, kind of key moments in your lives. And, I just want to mention the since time immemorial, because it's an interesting phrase to have at the end. And if you were to look up the word immemorial, it's really a recognition that we have kind of written things about what we remember. And since time immemorial is even before that, just recognizing that this land belonged to people before we had recorded history and memories. So it's an incredibly important statement for us. So our agenda for today, and our team and this amazing group of panelists are going to carry this. We're going to talk a little bit about our just approach to this series of learning together. We're going to have some information about the practice transformation cohort, the panel, some small group connection and interactions between you, and then some closing and next steps. So with that, I am going to turn this to Marco from our team. And Marco, if you want to introduce yourself, and we've asked Marco to just kind of give us that grounding about the learning sessions. So thanks, Marco.
Thanks, Liz. My name is Marco Morales. I'm a project manager here at the North Sound ACH. I use he, him, his pronouns. We wanted to provide some framing around these conversations. Many of you attended the last learning session last month, which was titled Racial Justice, Acts of Resistance. So we want to provide framing around how we build on top of the different learning sessions and provide context on how we can use every learning session to kind of give us a more holistic view of what it means to belong, and what acts we can take and what acts organizations, individuals, institutions can take towards belonging, right? Not being passive, but actually taking action towards belonging. And so, the monthly learning sessions are advancing a just and inclusive culture, sessions that bring the entire network together to deepen cross-cohort connections. They strengthen our community and our shared experiences, right? And they really explore local, regional, national models. We have different models at looking at belonging, but we want to frame them in ways where we see what other people around the country are doing, maybe around different states, what folks are doing here locally in the North Sound region, and also the cohort bring bright spots, right, to make learning and progress visible. Often, we may not be aware of what's happening in our communities, so these learning sessions are really a good opportunity for us to learn about other things that other people are doing here in the North Sound or in other places around the country. It's an open invitation, and it's an open invitation for anybody that wants to come and watch these, take part, participate, and be a part of these sessions. So this slide really talks about living into our shared beliefs, right? I mentioned earlier about this notion of practice or praxis, right? Whereas it's really living into what the beliefs are, right? I've made kind of a interesting analogy, right, around like what is just beliefs when it's not taken by action, right? Around like what it means to just believe in something, but you don't really do anything to fulfill that belief, right? And so belief is also grounded on practice, right? So what can we do together to accomplish this belief, right? So we know that all community members deserve to experience mental, social, physical, financial, and spiritual well-being, right? But how do we make that a reality, right? So it's about believing it, but also acting on it. We also understand that inherited legacies of systemic racism have perpetuated trauma and exclusion, particularly among indigenous populations of community of colors, right? So if we have these legacies, again, what is the action, right, to write new legacies, as individuals, as organizations, and again, as institutions? How do we leverage that power, right, to rewrite new legacies? We also believe that together we can create those new legacies, right, and the conditions that ensure a sense of belonging for all people who call this region home. So this is the history that we've been inherited. What can we do together to create a new history, right? So it's again on this notion of practice. It's this practice notion, but this is the context we were inherited. So we have it. What can we do differently moving forward, right? And then we also recognize that we are accountable to each other and the well-being of future generations. So if we understand this is a context, this is what we inherited, how can we have accountability to one another, so we can create a better world for everybody, where everybody is included, is part of the table, and is part of the decision-making process, right? Which is very key in creating a world where we all belong. And so those are some of our shared beliefs here at the North Sound ACH. And I'm very excited for today's presentation as it builds on the one from last month. And I just want to say thank you, and I'll pass it on to our next speaker.
Good morning. Thank you, Marco and Liz. My name is Nika Osteen. I use she, her pronouns, and I co-lead the practice transformation cohort, along with Yuki Yang from Ideal Options and Kathy Asada from Center for Human Services. So I just wanted to start with a brief introduction before we jump into our panel about what practice transformation is and what areas this cohort is planning to focus on moving forward. So practice transformation is a broad term that refers to changing how we care for individuals to create conditions for better health outcomes, improved patient-provider relationships, and decreased healthcare spending. So it does tend to be a more clinical term, and the focus areas for this work is a little more clinical than some of the other areas in the network, but we really recognize that practice transformation is necessary at all levels and across all sectors to ensure equitable well-being for all. So in our cohort, we have folks from all sectors, not just the clinical sectors. We have community-based organizations and tribal partners and lots of other sectors outside of, clinical. So for our cohort, we are focusing on these 4 areas. If you were involved in the Medicaid transformation project at all, these probably look pretty familiar. So we're really hoping that we can build on the momentum from MTP as we move forward and think of new and innovative ways to ensure that our community thrives. So the 4 areas are oral health, behavioral health integration, substance use, that's really building on the opioid work that we've done in the past, and then reproductive and sexual health. So today we're going to be talking about stigma. And this was something that our practice transformation team talked about and decided we wanted to focus on because everybody that is here has either seen or experienced the impacts of stigma. And we know how that impacts ourselves, how that impacts other people, and both in clinical settings and otherwise. So the definition of stigma is the negative social attitudes attached to a characteristic of an individual that may be regarded as mental, physical, or social deficiency. So as we move forward with our work, it's really important that we acknowledge stigma and where it shows up, because those attitudes that are perpetuated by stigma can lead to biases in how people are treated and the care that they receive. Like I said, we can all think of examples of stigma and bias in the areas that we have focused on, and we know that those lead to poor health outcomes for people. We're not really going to get to dive into oral health today, but we know that stigma in oral health is a huge factor. You know, if people are missing teeth or have poor oral health, it can be really difficult to find and maintain a job. And people are often treated poorly. I also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that everybody in this room, in this virtual space, is bringing in our own biases, including internal biases, and that may impact what we hear, how we process the stories that are shared today. So please be mindful that this is a place of learning and conversation. And I also wanted to acknowledge that there are people in this room that have lived experience with everything that we're talking about. We're not talking about other people. People here have lived experience. So please be respectful and compassionate in your learning and engage with an open mind. And finally, just as a community that has committed to belonging, as Marco grounded us in, it's essential that we really start to understand the roles of stigma and bias and how that impacts our region. So before I pass it over to Megan to jump into our panel, I wanted to ground us in a piece of poetry from Andrea Gibson. So let me tell you, I know there are days it looks like the whole world is dancing in the streets when you break down like the doors of the looted buildings. You are not alone and wondering who will be convicted of the crime of insisting you keep loading your grief into the chamber of your shame. You are not weak just because your heart feels so heavy. I have never met a heavy heart that wasn't a phone booth with a red cape inside. Some people will never understand the kind of superpower it takes for some people to just walk outside. So I will go ahead and pass it on to Megan, and thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Nika. And thank you, Marco. And thank you, Liz, for getting us kind of situated in the conversation that we're going to be having today. I am Megan Tripp. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a project manager within the practice transformation team here at North Sound ACH. I'm very honored to be facilitating this conversation with some really incredible panelists today. So I'm going to start us off by inviting each of the panelists to introduce yourself and your organization and share a personal story. How have you experienced stigma in your personal life or in your work? And we're going to get started with hearing from Robin.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you to Monty and the team for inviting me to come be a part of this panel. My name is Dr. Robin Henderson. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist by training. I'm also the chief executive of behavioral health for Providence in the Oregon region. We have 107 psychiatric beds, fully integrated behavioral health and primary care, and a whole bunch of other types of behavioral health services across the continuum. I'm also the chief clinical officer for Work to Be Well. And Work to Be Well is our youth mental health education division that works primarily with teenagers around reducing stigma and reducing the barriers to accessing care and increasing the ability for people to talk about their experiences with mental health, their experiences with mental illness, and all of the other types of richness that I think we're all here to talk about today in terms of how we talk with compassion about mental illness and how we talk about how that impacts us. In my looking at my own history, I've got a lot of stories of stigma and a lot of different stories that I could share. But in particular, what I want to share is about my own family. My daughter is 20 years old. She lives with a mental illness. She has anorexia nervosa. She also suffers with extreme anxiety and depression, and is a suicide survivor. And as a professional who works in the mental health field, at times, it is difficult to show up in that space as a parent when people see me as a psychologist. So there's a lot of, when I reveal that I have a daughter who has significant mental health issues, there's a lot of judgment that comes with that. And there's been almost like this sense of, oh, well, gosh, that stigma that people have about families that have somebody, especially with anorexia nervosa, there's a presumption that there must be dysfunction in your family. Many people who treat eating disorders believe that eating disorders come from family dysfunction. And when we first got her into treatment, there was a lot of fear from the treatment team of unveiling what would be the family secret in my personal family while they were treating my daughter for anorexia nervosa. And I kept saying, we're here. My daughter, if she doesn't get this care, she's going to die. And whatever family secret there is, we'd like to know it too, right? And so over the course of 3 months of very intensive family therapy and working with my family, one of the last things the treatment team said to us was, you taught us a lot about our assumptions, especially with anorexia nervosa, because our assumptions have always been that there's a dysfunctional family behind that. And the reality is you're a very functional family and you have a daughter with anorexia nervosa. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for sharing that. That's a great jumping off point. Moving on to Kevin with Mount Baker Presbyterian Church. Same question. Introduce yourself, your organization, and how have you experienced stigma in your personal life or your work?
My name is Kevin Riley, and I am the lead pastor for Mount Baker Presbyterian out in Concrete, Washington. We took a bold step in the community a little over a year ago to bring medically assisted treatment to a rural community that desperately needed it. Stigma is something that has plagued me my entire life, not only through my own life through addiction, but even now in a professional setting. I sent over a couple of slides. Is there any way we could pull up that first one, the unhealthy one? Well, that works. So I wanted to share a little bit about mine and my wife's story in regards to stigma. As you can see on the left, that was 2013 was our most recent booking photo. My wife and I are both actively in recovery ourselves. We have a little over 8 years completely clean and sober. We've been able to vacate all of our felony convictions, the whole 9 yards, and completely rebuild our lives. And so there was a time when in the far left picture of me, when a guy showed up at a church in Burlington and walked in and asked for help. The guy who was behind the counter, who's a very, very nice individual, very polite, got up from behind the counter and walked and put his arm around me, walked out the door and said, we contribute to other organizations. Please go see them for help. And I said, but you're a church, you're supposed to help people like me. And he goes, oh, we do through other organizations. And so that was one huge, big piece of stigma that hit me as I was addicted, right? The church is supposed to be the most welcoming place of all. And it was the one that was asking me to leave the fastest. Another instance of stigma was with my wife. When she was in labor for our first son and we went to the hospital. We were both former IV meth users. And as we were in the hospital and they were hooking her up to all the machines and the IVs and all that stuff, the nurse was having a really hard time finding a vein to be able to hook her up to the IV. And we just said, hey, we are IV users that are in recovery. Your best bet for finding a vein is over here. And the nurse immediately turned around and crossed her arms and looked at us and said, are we going to have to drug test the baby? No. Hey, are you Thank you for telling me how to do my job better. Thank you for your honesty, anything like that. And so with that stigma in that setting, it left us feeling like somebody was going to come and take our baby away. We were scared and we wanted to run away and leave from the hospital. So another instance where a church welcomed me and was able to break through stigma was one time I showed up at a church in Cedar Woolley that's no longer in existence. It's a Trinity Presbyterian. And as I showed up there, broken, strung out, they offered me a place to stay outside the building. They ran power outside the building so I could stay warm, and they helped lift me up in a way to just really trust the church and move forward. And that's one of the reasons I'm where I am today. Another instance with my wife happened when she was in labor for our second child. We ended up down in Seattle, and during that labor procedures, things went really bad, and she almost died. And as there was about 15 different nurses and anesthesiologists trying to get needles in her, we let them know, and we were scared, but we said, hey, she's in recovery. This is the best spot for a vein. We got, thank you. Do you need a higher pain dose? This makes our job easier. And there was no stigma that came with it. And so I wanted to point out those two varying stories, because when we meet somebody who is coming to you broken, how we react to that can send it one way or the other. And so the first two stories were not how to meet somebody who's suffering. The second two stories are. So, and with that, I'd like to hand it to the next person.
Great, thank you for sharing those stories, Kevin. Our third panelist today is Mariotta Gary Smith with the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. And again, the same question: how have you experienced stigma in your personal life or in your work?
Good morning. Thank you, Megan, and good morning to everyone. I want to first appreciate Dr. Zenia Junkir, who is a dear beloved of mine, for the invitation to participate in today's learning space, and I am very honored to be here with all of you. I also want to acknowledge the stories from Robin and Kevin, just really beautiful and vulnerable stories, and I appreciate your willingness to share those. My experience with stigma is as unique as the two stories you've heard before. As a person who exists in the body of a Black woman, a Black femme, I have a unique experience of having different kinds of stigma placed upon me. I am a sixth generation Pacific Northwestern person, right? So my family has been here for quite a long time. For some people, I'm a unicorn, and that's great. And for other people, I am not. I'm normal, right? Whatever that means. In my experience, I have been expected to be a statistic, right? So I'm not supposed to be here with you this morning. I'm not supposed to be able to share my experience and my story, because I should be incarcerated, or I should be dead, or I should be in a lot of other places that people assume because of the way I present and engage in the world. And then I am also someone who experiences stigma because I am someone who has been asked to be in the shared space with you. So that makes me safe, that makes me unique. And there is a strength and an understanding and a superpower that's associated with my presentation and the way I exist in the world, which removes my humanity and my personhood, right? So I'm supposed to be able to do all of the things and all of the things and all of the things and stand for all of the people that I'm supposed to support and work for and work in service to. And I'm supposed to be able to hold all of the space and still not have enough space for myself. And so it's an interesting experience as I engage in the world for the work that I do, particularly in reproductive justice for Black women and Black femmes and Black pregnant folks, is that I consistently engage with folks who question the ability of folks who look like me or communities that look like mine, adjacent and my own, who are not able to make their own decisions because folks don't believe that the capacity for us to make the decision is present, and that other folks need to govern and decide what that looks like for us. And so it's been an interesting experience for someone who prides herself as a strategic sex worker. I use that phrase very deliberately. And that I want to talk to folks about the power of the decision to be made by those who have the ability to make the decision. And then what does it look like when folks do not have the opportunity for the decision to be made, that those are separate things. And so a lot of my work is grounded in creating spaces that have actionable agitation, where people are going to be held accountable by me as someone who's using my lived experience and the privilege of the education that I have to create spaces for people to recognize if they're going to be part of the process to support other folks' decision-making, or if they're going to be part of the process to remove them from the experience so people can make decisions, right? You get to make a choice. But in the end, the decision should be made by the folks who are most impacted. And most of the times in the rooms that I'm in, it's none of the folks who are present. It's the folks who are not there. And so that's my wordy offering to you this morning. And thank you very much.
That's excellent. We love wordy. I want to thank all three of you for your vulnerability and honesty as you're kicking off this conversation. You know, we don't know each other, but you all offered so much realness in your introductions. I think that it bodes well for the remainder of this conversation. For this round, I would like each of you to just respond to each other conversationally. And I have a couple of leading questions. First of all, what does stigma mean to you, and how is it similar or different from bias?
I think stigma comes from a lack of education on the topic. I think that stigma is a perceived belief that is projected from other people's beliefs, right? So like, yeah, I mean,
I agree, Kevin. I feel
come
like
on, somebody else jump in here, because like I'm like,
I agree with you. I feel like stigma is a softened version of a bias, right? Bias is really large and can cover a lot of things, right? It's really grand, like an umbrella term almost. And stigma can get really specific about a behavior or an idea, right? So for me, when I'm working with young people, young parenting people, there's a stigma around young people who choose to parent, right? That young people aren't qualified to be a parent, or they don't know how to parent. And there is a bias in the work that I do around people who choose to parent. But when you get specific around young parenting people and young people with a cultural ethnic identity who are parenting, not understanding that it may be a cultural relationship or grounding, right? That I think it gets really narrowed when you get into a stigma. You can get real specific and you can point to someone or something and it's like, I don't like that. And I also feel like we all have these, right? So I think it's important to sort of tussle with the fact that we all hold biases, right? We have these things, we have prejudgments, right? We are human, that is part of what we do. Having to unlearn how to do that when you're working in service for people is the most complicated thing I've ever experienced. It's incredibly challenging.
And I agree with you. And one of the things that I think about when I think about stigma, I see it rooted in fear. In that fear of what we don't understand, fear of what we don't know, all of our assumptions and biases, that play into that. But really it comes from this place of a lack of understanding and fear. And whether it's that stigma of seeing somebody who's houseless living on the streets and therefore you've got all these assumptions that they must be, they must have done this to themselves, and all of the assumptions that go into that all come from that place of really deep fear, I think, for people.
Well, not only a deep fear as well, but I also think in a lot of ways, stigma comes from a place of we see things in the person who's suffering that we hate about ourselves. And so if we can vilify that person, we can feel better about ourselves. Yep,
100%.
I appreciate what you've both said. And so I'm also really, I think what also happens in the fear that can really contribute to how folks engage. And I also think about how folks are, when someone is fearful or scared, you return or you default to what you know best, which may or may not be the best thing for anyone else that you're engaging with. And so that can continue to create this cycle of harm and trauma that for the person who is sort of exhibiting this and then the person who's receiving it, right? And so not being able to honestly engage with what's happening around the fear or the trauma really perpetuates these really harmful spaces for folks. And being able to put language to what's happening and figuring out the best way to sort of disengage or detangle yourself from what's happening. I hear often in some of my work, people love to tell me, because I'm someone who believes in it, people tell me feelings aren't facts. And I don't agree with that. I push back and I tell them actually feelings are, because they help inform what people are going to do. So I'm not going to dismiss what people are feeling, but I'm also not going to say that they may not lead you in the way you want to go, but they certainly inform where you want to go, right? And so people, they love to kind of get at me with that, like, oh, well, feelings aren't facts. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna do that part, because we experience things through our feelings, right? We allow our feelings tell us where to go sometimes. And so to dismiss that part of people's ability to make decisions or to figure out what they're doing, I think is really, I find it really disrespectful as someone who doesn't like to be told that feelings aren't facts.
I really appreciate what you're saying in that respect, because the feelings that come in here are all colored by our own lived experiences. And that's one of the other pieces about stigma. It's the lived experiences that you've had, that I've had, that really color how I see different things. In my own personal history as a psychologist, I used to treat people with bulimia and anorexia long before I had a child. And those experiences really colored everything that came in with that. But that's not, when I have my own child and raising my own child. But there's a number of other pieces that also play into that as well. How I was raised as a child, what things I saw in my life as a child, what things that I experienced, all inform bias and stigma. And we don't see those things in, when I look at you all have lived experience that there's no way I can know.
Yes, I appreciate that. I think that's a great point you raise, Dr. Robin, about understanding the lived experience of folks, right? So like even hearing the amazing stories from you and Kevin, I'm thinking about those experiences that are part of my family history, right? And recognize where I find connection in what you're saying. So there's a shared understanding. It's not my lived experience, right? What you all have experienced is not mine, but I'm remembering what I've witnessed and experienced through others in my family. So I have an understanding of it, but to also recognize that your experiences are valid. And what happens is that when you start to invalidate the humanity and experiences of other people, you get into these situations. I think a lot of what I'm experiencing now with the dumpster fire that I feel like I'm living in right now in terms of the larger world, I think is grounded in some places where there is a strong denial of the lived experiences and humanity of folks who are saying, this is not okay, this is not what we like, this is not what we asked for. And for those who are in places of decision-making and power, they have no relevance because they've never experienced that, or they've experienced it so far back in their own history that they can't touch it, right? So I tell people, like, for me, when I talk about my family, my father's family, for example, my father picked cotton. My father's 75 years old. So I don't have to reach back for anybody to tell me the experience of Black folks being exploited for free labor. I can talk about the history of chattel slavery, but my father picked cotton and he's 75. Right. So I don't need to reach that far back in order to understand the impact of that on my family and my own living. And there are folks who have no desire to understand that lived experience because it isn't relevant to them. So therefore it doesn't have any value or it doesn't matter. And so I think it's really important in the work that I do to challenge people to figure out where they are. And then if the best option for them is to get out of the way so that I can continue to do my work. And, I like telling people to get out of the way. That's the petty part of me. I also revel in the petty. So I'm not saying that's good for everyone here who's with us this morning, but sometimes for me, reveling in the petty really allows me to get some stuff out and then I can do better.
I would love to hear from each of you how you have used your own personal reflections on your own internalized biases or your own internalized stigma or your experience with stigma. How have you used that to then work within your community to reduce stigma in other folks?
I'll go first. So everybody that works at Mount Baker Presbyterian that is a paid staff member, whether it's me or my wife or Jen, our outreach recovery specialist, we are all in recovery. And so when we step out into the community, we unapologetically lead with our stories because we've been able to amass several years in recovery, hold down jobs, do all that stuff. And so when we lead with our stories, we force people to see the humanity behind the addict or behind the person who is suffering, right? And so that puts people that of stigma on, because they're like, wait a minute. When I think of somebody who is an addict or somebody who's in recovery, they think about that first mugshot. They don't think about that picture at Cannon Beach, right? And so that helps open the doors to create conversation. And some of the things that we've done out at Mount Baker is we've done opioid use awareness nights where we've invited people in to come in and learn about the opioid epidemic in the community, actually give them numbers and statistics and partner with the local health department to do that. And then we partner with community action and do outreach events out into Marble Mount. And then we do our own Saturday outreach event at the Concrete Saturday Market, where we basically just put up a table and invite people into conversation. Because if we can just meet the people in a public place where they don't feel challenged or backed into a corner, and we can just actually help to work to educate, there's so much better conversation and dialogue that comes from that. And we just keep doing it unapologetically with love first.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I love the fact, Kevin, that you talk about leading with your stories. I think that's part of really what I've watched and been able to do in taking my family's story. People have all of these, again, assumptions. I'm a chief executive, I'm a psychologist, I'm supposed to have my proverbial stuff together in a way that is dehumanizing. Because people have these expectations, especially when you're a mental health professional, that you wrap this boundary around yourself. And I often talk about the fact that going into therapy is kind of like walking into a porn shop, right? Because you park in the back, and you go in the entrance where nobody can see you, and then when you leave, you go out the other entrance so that you don't go through the waiting room so that nobody else can see you, and that type of boundary that people who work in mental health put around themselves really kind of makes them inaccessible and almost inauthentic way. And I've always struggled with that. I understand it, and I can explain the psychological principles of I'm supposed to be the blank slate and all the other good stuff. And I really have, through the experiences my family's had, come to a place of I need to share my vulnerability and my story and my humanity in order for people to be able to share theirs. And it's a much deeper, more authentic way to connect with people and to make it okay for people to get help. So through our work at Providence over the last few years in the pre-pandemic space, we used to have a meeting where we met with 700 people in person. I know, a little shocking. We're going to get back there one of these days. But in the fall of 2019, I got up on a stage and told the story of my daughter's anorexia and her suicide attempts. And this was very, very raw and recent. This was in October. Her suicide, she'd been hospitalized in a psychiatric institution in May. So this was very, very, very recent, and chose to tell that story to all of my peers and all the people that I work with, because I needed them to be able to know that it's okay to share their stories. And what we saw in the aftermath of that were more and more of our own employees reaching out for help, talking about their own mental health issues. And to this day, 3 years later, I still get emails from people saying, thank you so much. And that's why, Kevin, I so respect what you're doing when you go out there in the concrete jungle and you put a table up and you share your story. You give people permission to share theirs and to seek help.
Mariotta, I would love to hear from you. And just a reiteration of the question. How have you used your lived experience to work to reduce stigma in your community or respond to the stories that we've heard so far?
I work at the Orcas Community Resource Center in Orcas Island. I am originally Colombian, and I've been living in the States for like 5-6 years now. And I love this job because I can unapologetically lead from my own story. I'm an immigrant. I came here for violence, domestic violence. A lot of the people I work with have a lot of trauma, and it's really hard for them to ask for help. So every time I have somebody, a new client that, have the power and the encouragement to come to my door or write me an email or give me a call asking me for something, I know how hard it is to do that. The stigma part for me, it came just by the simple fact that I'm Colombian and we have 60 years of drugs and violence. So since I live in the States, I always get asked for cocaine or this and that. And it's just like, I never done drugs in my whole life, like I didn't even know I would never leave the United States. So it's just really incredible to think about people ask you this kind of questions when they don't really know anything. It's just like, at this point for me, it's just like normal, kind of like, I don't really think about it anymore because I say kind of like, I try to put myself in their shoes and wonder why they're asking that, or why they don't have, like another perception or big, any other thoughts about somebody else just because where they from or what they do. So that's where I feel stigma personally. And with my clients, I try to let them know that I am an equal, because I feel like they see me as different just because I'm behind a desk, but I'm behind a desk being an equal, and I'm here for you. So I feel like when you have your own personal experience, that help you to do a better job, and don't really see the stigma as a bad thing, just as some like kind of ignorance. And that's what we're here for, to teach people, to share the good. So I feel like a stigma is a bad thing, but also if you learn how to teach other people about not having a stigma coming from your experience, that's the best thing that you can do in this kind of situations. In the job we all do.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Daniela. I am going to pass it back over to Mariotta, but I will just quickly mention, after this question, we're going to move into some breakout rooms, and we're all going to have an opportunity to share our own experiences, and then we're going to come back and do kind of a larger group discussion briefly. So we will have time to hear from other folks as well, but back over to Mariotta if you had a response to the answers that we've heard from Kevin and Robin so far.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for sharing your story, Daniela. I appreciate that. What I will offer is that one way that I've chosen to utilize my experience is that I really work hard to cultivate brave spaces. I know people use the phrase like safe spaces, creating safe spaces for folks to engage. And while I appreciate and understand that, sometimes spaces are not safe for folks to share, right? And it's hard to know how to create or curate opportunities like that. I strive to engage in curating brave spaces in my work, because I want people to, I want to honor folks' decision or their choosing to engage. Some folks don't want to. And so I want to be able to figure out the best way to curate a space where folks feel comfortable and that their full presence is being honored, and it doesn't require them to engage. I also am someone who wants to honor the transparency and the vulnerability that that some of us use in being able to engage in conversation and create change is really challenging. And so what happens is, for an example, so the organization that I am a co-foundress of the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, which was created, it was born out of a professional sexuality conference I attended back in 2009. And across 3 days, I didn't see anyone else who remotely looked like me in any of the workshops I attended. And I didn't see anyone until the last day at the pool when we were all leaving, right? And one turned into 3, turned into 8, turned into 18 people who wanted to come together and figure out how we could stay connected because we had not seen each other across these 3 days. What we ended up doing is that we decided we wanted to stay connected and create a space for us within this organization that used words that promoted the idea of having diverse and inclusive spaces, but they actually didn't. And that's part of that accountability for me lies on the people who decided that they wanted to utilize the language, but not practice the work of creating those spaces. And then part of the responsibility I felt was for myself and these folks who decided we wanted to be in shared space, that we needed to curate that space for ourselves in this organization. And so we chose to create a space that at the time we felt was safe. It actually was not, because we had to figure out how to create a space where we could all be present with each other as we showed up, right? Because we all had other things that we needed to work on and deal with. And so we ended up calling it a brave space, and we wanted it to be held specifically for folks who had very specific identities. So our space was held for people who identified as a Black, Indigenous, or another person of color, other cultural identity. And we asked for our accomplices, most of whom were white presenting or white folks, that the best way they could support us is to support us by telling their colleagues that this space is held for Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color, which meant that mostly white folks would not be involved in the space. That's a hard conversation to have, right? But it was a brave conversation because we were asking people to support our need to have a brave space where we could talk about our own issues that did not engage or have other folks present who weren't part of that issue, right? We were talking about, as my Nana said, we were talking about house business. And you don't put house business out in the street. My grandma was real specific about, she had a thing about respect. Miss Liz knows my family, so she knows what I'm talking about. And so we really worked hard to create a brave space, and we modeled it for other folks. So there were other groups that decided to engage in the same practice that we had, and we participated as an accomplice to that space being present for folks who needed it. So I think it's important to recognize that. As Kevin and Robin and Daniela noted, like there's an importance around being able to meet folks where they're at, right? There's an importance to being able to be vulnerable and transparent for me within some sense of a guardrail. I don't think we need to, I'm not someone who's going to throw all of my business on the table because that's just not how I engage. And I don't need to, right? I don't believe in the exploitation of someone's trauma or harm to make you feel or think that or figure out how you're going to engage with me. That's not what I want. But I also, to Daniela's point, want to be clear that whatever you believe about me, that most likely isn't the truth, but we can have a brave space to talk about it if you want to ask questions, but that there's going to be a boundary in how we're going to engage in that space. And then we can figure out if we're going to be in alignment or not. And to not be in alignment is also okay, right? And that you get to figure out how you want to engage with me, and I get to decide how I'm going to engage with you. And we can walk away respectfully if that means that we're not going to work together. And so that's what I've really learned in my experiences and in my work.
Thank you for sharing that, Mariotta. And there's a lot of response in the chat to some of the language that you used, appreciation for the use of the word accomplice, and the distinction between a safe space and a brave space, which I think warrants further discussion. Not going to jump into that right at the moment. We're going to go into some breakout rooms. So Natalie is going to put us into breakout rooms, random assignment, 3 to 4 people. We're going to have about 10 minutes for discussion. Talking about what we've heard today, what is resonating, what this might translate to as far as working to reduce stigma within the Collaborative Action Network, within our cohorts, within each of our organizations, and within our communities. Stacy has put some discussion questions in the chat, so whenever Natalie is ready, we will go into breakout rooms, and then we will have a little bit of a chance to hear from folks about some conclusions from those discussions when we come back to the larger group. Welcome back from your breakout discussions. I hope that your discussions were as enlightening and motivating as the one that we were just having. If there's anything that you would like to elevate in the larger group, or if you have any questions that arose that you would like to ask any of our panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself, put some comments, put some questions in the chat, and we'll keep this discussion going.
Hi, this is Danita Price, she, her pronouns from Pioneer Human Services. I want to thank the group that we just had a conversation. We got kind of cut off at the end, but it was a great conversation. And for me, and the others can speak up on their question, I wanted to get the panelists' point of view on images through media, through all forms of media that perpetuate stereotypes, that perpetuate stigma, that monetize and are used to actually monetize and keep things going. I would love to get their point of view on that and how we can stop it, obviously.
Can you be more specific on the social media side of things? Do you mean like people who are taking selfies with a homeless individual and a $20 bill going, hey, look at me? Or are you looking at the Facebook videos that pop up where somebody goes and gives a homeless man a bunch of money and they follow them to see what they spend their money on to kind of do an aha, or things like that? Is that the direction you're going?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
To include, so even though that yes and yes, to include print, media, news, so it's all, those are also the ones. So it's that paradox, right? So it's the paradox of, yeah, they're giving someone a person that doesn't have a home or a person that's on the street food or money. There's also it feels, I don't know them personally, so it feels a bit like they're exploiting that situation, right? So yes. Thank you.
So I just shared this with the panelists in the other side of the thing in our breakout room. Is I don't know really how to address the Facebook side of things other than there's or the social media side of things other than there's like 3 ways to really engage with an individual who is like that. There's the handout, right? And, you know, people taking the selfie, look at me, I'm so cool, I'm giving this dude $20. Well, nothing really comes from that. It's everybody gets something that they want. They get a little bit of like, hey, buddy, you're so great, look at what you did. Or, you know, and the homeless guy or whoever's suffering gets a little bit of money. There's other instances of like, look at, I pulled this guy out of the gutter, right? And so, you know, that's the hand up method, where that just skews the relationship and puts people in a position of authority over the person that they're helping, right? And then there's the hand across method, where we just quietly, uncomfortably crawl into the person suffering with them. And so I don't think a social media argument is the place to happen, because nobody's on social media to learn or educate themselves. I think that's when you try to find the person and just individually have a conversation that says, I'm wondering why you're doing this, and address it with them. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Thank you, Kevin.
I think the only thing I would add to that, social media is such a fascinating space. We spend a lot of time in our work with youth around social media. They're digital natives. This is the space they share and show up in. And we do a lot of education and work with youth around how to intervene in different types of scenarios that show up in social media. One of the best places to learn about that for young people is a group called #ICanHelp. And their whole entire mission, and I'll put it in the chat, their whole entire mission is around educating youth, who I think are going to be the people who are going to change the conversation in social media in the future.
Thank you, Robin.
The only thing I would add to that, appreciating Kevin and Robin's contribution, is that in the work I've done engaging with young people, I ask young people to create the images and the visuals that they want to see, so that they get to define and dictate what they need for themselves. And that's across all kinds of identities that young people hold, right? So for example, Awakshan created a curriculum. We wrote our own sexual education curriculum, and we based it upon the folks that we were working with, the young people that we were engaging with at the time. Many of the authors lived across the country, so we had very unique geographic perspectives around how to engage with young people regarding sexuality education. What is it that they wanted to know? They wanted to learn about safety. They wanted to learn about body autonomy. They wanted to learn about consent. They wanted to learn how to write a love poem to themselves. Like, so we had 8 lessons that were very specific, very different. The images that we used were images that they designed for themselves, that they wanted to see. They wanted to see their own bodies. They wanted to see bodies that look like theirs. They wanted to see all kinds of body shapes, sizes, abilities. All the things that they wanted to see were very specific, and they were also dictated by them. And so I think it's important to consider when you're looking at media and the use of media across the various ways that that it presents, for me, I know that the images that I see that don't represent me, for every image I do see, I know there is one that does. And if there isn't, I have an image of myself that reflects what it is that I want to see, or I know people, or you know, I have folks that are modeling other things. While that's hard in this instant gratification age of social media, I also think it's important to, with the young people in my life, I consider myself a very good auntie godmama. I'm the cool fly auntie godmama. I cherish that role for my kiddos. But they are responsible to tell me what it is that they want to see. So we talk about the images and the things that they consume, and I'm like, so tell me why this appeals to you. Tell me why this is important to you. And sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree, but I'm always trying to make sure that I understand what is the point of interest for them and why this image is important. And then if it's something that I find a little disconcerting, I offer a suggestion like, well, tell me what you think about this. And so it's about engaging and learning, honoring what young people have. There's a lot of information that young people have, and they have a lot of knowledge, and being able to support different images and ideas that they have in relationship to my work, that's important, so that they can see themselves reflected across all of the ways that they identify.
I don't see anybody unmuting themselves and speaking up with another question. So I wanted to elevate something from the chat, going back to the conversation that we had before the breakout rooms. Can we get just a brief distinction of a brave space versus a safe space?
Yeah, I can offer a little bit about that. For me, a brave space is, I curate brave spaces that allow folks to be fully present, to hold their vulnerability and their transparency, one in each hand, and to also acknowledge that the way folks engage look different, right? Some folks are not going to necessarily do a lot of talking. There may be a lot of processing. That silence, while it is awkward, is okay, and it is honored. And that everyone has something to teach and to learn, and to ask folks to come into that space, holding those things present. I also have to do my own work. Even if I'm the facilitator, I still have the opportunity to be taught something that I did not know. I have the opportunity to share something that I know really well. And my job is to sort of hold guardrails for that space, and to be really clear about when someone feels the feelings that someone has about what someone has said, that's an honest, real moment. And the bravery in that moment is to acknowledge the feelings and the words and to figure out where the point of harm occurred, and then to decide with those folks what needs to happen next. And that may include removing them from the room. They may not want to engage or participate anymore. They may want to go and have another conversation, or they may let it be and we move on, right? But we're not going to, I work hard to not let things escalate to the point where everyone is uncomfortable, where everyone feels awkward, where everyone feels harm. And that is something I've learned trial by fire. So I haven't perfected it by any means. I think it's always, it shifts a lot. You have to negotiate a lot of space. But I appreciate a brave space that allows people's humanity to be grounded, as opposed to a safe space, which actually may not be safe for a lot of people because we don't know what people are bringing or coming into the space with. And so I try to allow time for folks to ground themselves and provide an opportunity for real transparent discussion that honors all of the things that people bring into the space with me, as much as what I bring into the space for other people.
Great.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it was really helpful for me. I hope that it was helpful for other folks as well. I do want to acknowledge we're in our last couple minutes of designated time, so I'm going to pass over to Nika to wrap us up. But as you may have seen in the chat, some of us will stay on the line beyond if folks are interested in continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Megan. I just want to give such a big appreciation to our panelists today. I really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing stories. And I loved so many good little bits that I've pulled out that I'm going to take forward with me. And I hope everybody who was here also had some great breakout sessions, and I appreciate everybody being engaged. Before we wrap up, and like Megan said, after we do these last reminders, we'll still be on the call if people want to keep debriefing and chatting. We love to have that space with you. So I think Stacy's going to chat out some resources for you in our resource library. As a reminder, this is where we keep all of the things that we talk about today, the resources that are shared, the recordings, lots of stuff to learn in there. So please make sure to check that out. Share these resources with your community, with your staff, with your leadership. There is also a link that will be put in the chat. It's a quick, shouldn't take you more than 2 to 3 minutes survey to ask about your experience here. It really helps us improve these sessions and will help us decide on some next steps. And if you are a contracted network member, it is required. So please make sure you go ahead and fill that out. Thank you, Stacy, for sticking it in there. And then just the final reminder, next month is our partner convening. So you all should have calendar invites. More information will be coming out soon. But it is August 9th through 11th, 1:30 to 4 on Tuesday, 9 a.m. to 4 on Wednesday, and 9:30 to 1 on Thursday. So again, really appreciate everybody showing up in this space, the vulnerability, the stories. I really appreciate the participants who jumped in and shared their personal stories too. And I will just lead us back into continuing this discussion. If anybody wants to jump in with questions, there's our team email if you have anything you want to follow up with. And thank you everybody for coming today.